Bienvenidos a todos los lectores de Inteligencia Estratégica y de Inversor Global. Soy Felipe Ramírez, el gerente de contenido de Inversor Global, y acá me encuentro junto a Jim Rickards, editor de nuestro servicio Inteligencia Estratégica. Jim Rickards es un abogado y economista con vasta trayectoria en el mundo de las finanzas globales, y no solo eso, sino también en el mundo de la inteligencia. Ha asesorado a agencias como la CIA, el Pentágono, y trabajado con grandes bancos de inversión en temas de geopolítica, inversiones y todo lo que viene atado a eso. En este momento Jim se encuentra en una cuarentena voluntaria en el estado de New England, en una ubicación que no podemos divulgar completamente. Más allá de eso, solo podemos decir que está en las montañas y que afortunadamente está bien. How are you, Jim?
I'm fine. Muchas gracias, Felipe. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Thanks you for having us with you at your place in the distance. So we're going to talk a little bit about the most important topics that you usually cover in your publication, and our readers are interested on. We'll talk a little bit about debt. We'll talk about gold. We'll talk about the Fed policies, the stock market, and a little bit about cryptocurrencies. What do you think about that?
Sounds good.
Great. So let's start. Let's start talking about debt. We can say that we are in the most debtor world in the history. So I'd like you to please share your thoughts on the scenario that we are currently going through, and the most important question I'd say is when this bubble will finally burst.
Right. Well, first of all, you're right that this is about the most indebted period in the history of the world. I've warned about that for a long time, and I have ways of measuring it, ways of thinking about it, and I've included that in my books, and we'll talk about that. But I never thought I would see so much debt so quickly as we have seen in the last few months. Now, the way I think about debt, corporate debt, some of it's fine, some of it defaults. We've had a wave of bankruptcies in the United States. I'm sure that's true elsewhere around the world. So, corporate debt is a risky instrument. It can pay a high yield or it can go to zero. That happens all the time. So what we're really talking about is government debt. Because no one expects governments to go bankrupt, although we all know that occasionally they do default. We've seen many cases of that, but certainly not, the United States or the UK or Spain or France. No one expects any of those countries to default anytime soon. But the way I think about that is I use the debt to GDP ratio, because debt is not automatically a problem. It may be a problem or it may not be a problem. It all depends on how much income or output you have to service the debt. So just to give a simple example, let's say you have a credit card and you have a $50,000 balance on your credit card. You owe the bank $50,000. Is that a problem? Well, if you make $20,000, it's a big problem. You're probably going to go bankrupt. But if you make $200,000, you could probably, write a check and pay it off. So the answer as to whether the debt is a problem or not can only be thought about in relation to your income. And so I use the debt to GDP ratio. I say, how much debt does a country have? How much debt is outstanding? And how big is their GDP? And when you use that ratio, if you're at, say, 30% or even 40%, that's a comfortable ratio. Yes, you have some debt, but you also have, say, a strong economy and your ability to service the debt by collecting taxes or other sources of revenue is very reasonable, and that debt level is sustainable. But when you get up to 60% happens to be the level under the Maastricht Treaty, where the members of the European Union are not supposed to have debt in excess of 60% of their GDP. Now, many of them do. I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule, but that's where Angela Merkel gets a little bit upset when you're above 60%. And Spain and France and some other, Italy certainly are above that threshold. But there's another threshold that's important, which is 90%. And 90% comes out of the research of Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart, who are both Harvard professors, although I read just the other day that Carmen Reinhart has been appointed chief economist of the World Bank. So she's going to be in a position to actually, not just come up with theories, which are good ones in her case, but actually implement policy. But they've done an enormous amount of research. They had this book, this time it's different, but beyond the book, they've had many academic papers by the National Bureau of Economic Research, et cetera. And what they've shown in developing markets, developed markets throughout the 20th century, recently, in the distant past, no matter where they look, once a country gets above 90% debt to GDP, a couple things happen. Number one, debt is no longer productive. The idea of borrowing is I'll borrow $1.
And I'm going to do something with that money. Huh?
Yeah, I'll borrow the dollar, I'll spend the dollar, but I'll get $1.20 of GDP because I'll spend it on something, but then the recipient, he'll spend it, and then someone else will spend it, and by what's called velocity, or the turnover of money, you'll actually get more than you borrow. That's Keynesian economics, very simplified version of it. But what Rogoff and Reinhardt have shown is once you get past 90%, that's no longer true. You borrow $1 and you spend $1, but you might only get 90 cents or 80 cents of GDP. In other words, you reach a point where you cannot borrow your way out of debt. You cannot borrow your way to get enough productivity to get out of debt. And then you're sort of in a doom loop or a death spiral. Well, I mentioned 30% is comfortable, 60% is a problem in Europe, 90% is this critical threshold. The United States today is at 106%. But we are very rapidly moving to 120%. When you take the additional $5 trillion of new deficit spending that the Congress has approved and put that on top, and bear in mind, the GDP has gone down, right? So your denominator is shrinking, your numerator is going up, which means the fraction is going up, and now the debt is well in excess of 100%. It's actually coming into 120%. So all of a sudden, the United States starts to look like Italy, or for that matter, Lebanon or Japan, which is the highest of all. Now, the modern monetary theorists, MMT, modern monetary theory, whom I completely disagree with. I know a lot of them. I know Stephanie Kelton. She's a big brain. She's one of the thought leaders. She has a new book coming out. They say, so what? They say it doesn't matter. That you can take your debt to GDP ratio to not only 100%, but 200%, or in theory, even 300%. It just doesn't matter for two reasons. Number one, you can always print the money to pay off the debt. By the way, everything I'm talking about does not apply if you're borrowing in a different currency. If you're Argentina and you print pesos, but you're borrowing in dollars, that's a problem because you can't print dollars. But of course, the United States can print dollars. The ECB can print euros. Bank of Japan can print yen. And if that's the currency of your debt, just print up the money. What's the problem? And they have other solutions. If inflation starts to take off, just raise taxes. I'm not so sure about that. You borrow yourself into oblivion and you get inflation and you think you can tax your way out of it. That doesn't sound like a very good way to go. But the bottom line is that all the countries, starting with the United States, but all the major developed countries, are now in these sky high and rising debt to GDP ratios. Now, the question is, what's going to happen next? Interest rates are extremely low. The central banks have made them low. So the debt service is not that great. The debt is huge. But if you're only paying, a fraction of 1%, it's not as if you're incurring a lot of interest expense, which of course adds to the deficit. So that's the first thing. We don't have inflation. People who say that, the money printing that the central banks are doing to buy the debt, which they are, is inflationary. That's not true. That's a kind of gross misunderstanding, comes out of Milton Friedman, et cetera. It's not true. What does cause inflation is velocity, which is the turnover of money. If people lose confidence in money and they spend it, and someone else gets it and they spend it, and everyone's spending it because they want to run into hard assets, land, gold, silver, fine art, real estate, et cetera, or just buy a car because they think the price is going up, or a refrigerator, whatever it is. if you get that kind of velocity, inflation can happen very quickly. And we saw this in the late 1970s. So the real warning is not that any of these countries are going to default on their debt. They're not going to default on their debt because they can print the money. The danger is inflation. Now, if you said, do I see inflation right now? Absolutely not. We're going to see deflation, which is a different kind of danger. Deflation causes debt defaults because
Japan has been trapped into that like for 30 years.
Yeah, and Japan's been in a depression, in my view, since 1990. My view, the U.S. has been in a depression since 2007. We're in our second lost decade. Japan's entering their fourth lost decade. But it's as if all the countries in the world are getting more and more like Japan. I had a meeting with Sakakibara-san. He was very famous in the 1980s. He was known as Mr. Yen. He was an assistant finance minister in Japan, but he was called Mr. Yen. But very smart guy, very nice guy. And I confronted him on this. I said, Sakakibara-san, your debt keeps going up and your debt to GDP ratio is sky high and your GDP is kind of flat. And he said, yes, but you're missing one thing. He said, our population is going down, which is true. So on an overall basis, they're flat, but on a per capita basis, their GDP is actually outperforming. So I said, so the logic of that is that someday there'll be one person left in Japan and she will own the entire country and be the richest person in the world. That's sort of the
most debtor person in the world.
Right, exactly. But they'll have a lot of land and property. They have the imperial powers to go with it. But that's the reductio ad absurdum. But he was technically correct. Their per capita performance is better than their.
Let me ask you a question. I'm seeing that what you're being deploying is like a machinery with fuel with steam, and the steam has to go out somehow.
Right.
You're saying that the U.S. and Europe, they're not going to default. They're going to face inflation, but now the problem is deflation. And
Correct.
My question is, since we are based in Argentina, we have faced several episodes of inflation. Now we are devaluing the currency, but we publish in all Latin America. We publish in Chile, in Peru, in Mexico, Colombia, whatever. Ecuador is facing a probable default as well. Chile has just borrowed 25 billion to the IMF, which. And Chile was like the best student of the classroom, and now it's facing problems. My question is, since that now the U.S., for instance, is getting into a deflation, or it might be getting into a deflationary process, how this affect or would affect our economies?
Well, it's very bad for Argentina, and here's why. If you, or Chile for that matter, if you borrow in dollars, and then we have deflation, what does that mean? It means the value of cash is going up, but it also means the value of the debt is going up. So even if you have very low interest rates, which we do, when you borrow in dollars and the dollar is worth more, that's what deflation is. Your dollar is worth more. That means your debt is also worth more, meaning you owe more debt in real terms. The nominal debt's the same. So if you borrow 100 million, you owe 100 million. That doesn't change. But if you have deflation, so that the 100 million is actually more valuable. See, this hasn't happened since the 1930s. People don't understand. No one alive has really lived through a strong deflationary period. A lot of us have experience with inflation. We had it in the United States in the late 70s, and you're right, Argentina has had it on multiple occasions, and we can name other countries. People have a sense of what to do in inflation, but no one alive has experienced serious deflation since the 1930s. And if you did, you're 95 years old today. So people don't really understand it. But one of the things it does, it makes the real value of debt go up. So in real terms, you owe more money. So if you were in trouble to begin with and you borrowed money to get out of trouble, but the value of the debt goes up, now you owe more money. Now where do you stand? It may not show up in interest payments, but every dollar becomes more and more difficult to get. The dollar's worth more. So what it means is that you see a strong dollar. Now, your local currency could be weaker against the dollar. That's true. That could help exports. It could help tourism. So,
there's no tourism right now. There's
Yeah.
not going to be more tourism.
Well, you make a good point. There is no tourism today. I'm on a mountain, and you're in a home or studio or someplace. So right, there's no tourism going on today. But assuming it comes back next year, if you have a really strong dollar, in theory, an American could, or European for that matter, could look at Argentina. I've been to Argentina many times. It's one of the most beautiful countries in the world, and nice people, great restaurants. So, but it could look kind of like a bargain to somebody with a very strong currency.
Sure.
But that's not really Argentina's problem. Argentina needs more high tech industry, more high value added industry. It needs to break out of what's called the middle income trap, where you get to a certain point, but you can't get past that point because you can't just do it with assembly style manufacturing jobs. You need high value added jobs. You need technology is what you need. And all the developed economies are facing the same issue.
That applies to all of Latin America, Chile, Mexico, Colombia.
Correct, but it applies to most of Asia as well. This is China's problem. China's not going to continue the kind of growth we've seen over the last 20 years because they've used up that. When I studied development economics in the 1970s in graduate school, and we used to think that the hard part of development economics was getting from low income to middle income. And then we say, if you get to middle income, it's a straight path to high income. Turns out that's not true. Getting from low income to middle income is actually pretty straightforward. You have to get rid of corruption and you need to ease up on regulation. But you can, if you have foreign direct investment and people come from the country to the cities and you do, kind of simple manufacturing, et cetera, you can get a really good export machine going and earn hard currency reserves. So that part's easy. The hard part is getting from middle income to high income, because it turns out you can't just do more of the same. You actually need more high value added. You need technology today, and that's what I would advise every country to be working on, including Argentina, where the Argentina has a very highly educated workforce. I mean, Argentina would be a good case to why don't we make iPhones in Argentina instead of China, and we're going to bust up. The United States is going to bust up the supply chain to China. We're going to shut over time. Won't happen overnight, but we're going to pull those factories out or shut them down and move them elsewhere. So the question is, if I were advising any developing economy, I would say, how can I become a supplier to the United States? If they're going to get rid of China, which we are for a lot of reasons, I'd want to be in the list. And we're actually looking at Jordan as a country that could make cell phones. India is a big case because they have cheap labor. Argentina, I think, is a better candidate because they have a more highly educated workforce. What really happened? Did the gold go up or did the dollar go down?
Yeah.
And I would say what happened was the dollar went down. Now, the dollar has to depreciate to get inflation. I said that you should expect deflation, and for now you should. But coming back to the first question of the debt, how are we going to get out of all this debt? How are we going to do it? Well, we don't have the productivity. We'll get through this, I would say, depression that we're in right now, and some growth will return, but it's going to be returning from very low levels. We're not going to get back to the 2019 levels of output until 2022, in my view. It's going to be the better part of 2 years, if we're lucky, to get back to that level of output. But from the bottom, you'll have some decent growth numbers, but not enough to defease the debt, not enough to deal with the debt to GDP ratio that we talked about earlier. So how do you get rid of that debt? The answer is inflation. So I just said that we're going to experience deflation, which we are, but the solution to the debt is to have inflation, which is coming, but not yet. So how do you get from deflation to inflation? Well, central bankers don't know how to do it. They don't. They've been trying to get inflation for 12 years, and they can't do it. They never hit their target. So how do you? And I already said that borrowing more money doesn't work, because once you get past that 90% debt to GDP ratio, borrowing more money does not produce more growth. It doesn't. It produces some growth, but not as much as you borrowed. So your debt to GDP ratio keeps getting worse. So if you can't borrow your way out of it, and if central banks don't know how to create inflation, and if you have bad psychology, low velocity, and everyone's hoarding cash, which we just talked about, why wouldn't you just pile up a bunch of cash if cash is getting more valuable? The answer is probably should. How do you get out of it? Well, there's one and only one way to cause inflation, which is to raise the dollar price of gold, or put differently, devalue the dollar against gold. This was done twice in the 20th century, and it worked both times. The first time was 1933, when President Roosevelt devalued devalued the dollar. When he came into office, gold was $20 an ounce, and he devalued the dollar and made it $35 an ounce. That was a 75 increase. Now, this was in the middle of the greatest deflation in American history. But what went up, the only thing that went up was gold. But he did it because he wanted everything else to go up. Nothing happens in a vacuum. If you take the dollar price of gold up 50% or up 75%, the price of everything else comes up also. Gold at even $5,000 an ounce, that's the world of $400 a barrel oil, $20 a pound copper, et cetera. The price of everything goes up. So the way to devalue the dollar and get inflation is not with currency wars. Devaluing the dollar against the euro doesn't do you any good, because then they'll devalue the euro. So all the currencies are in the same boat: dollars, euros, yen, Swiss francs, sterling. Unless you're a currency trader or you're in the export business, don't pay any attention to that, because it doesn't matter. They're just going to go up and down against each other. How do you devalue all currencies at the same time? How do you do that? If you're measuring in currencies, it's a mathematical impossibility. If one goes down, the other one has to go up. But there is one way to do it, which is against gold, because gold can't fight back. Gold doesn't join the currency wars, and you can devalue all the currencies against gold. That will give you the inflation. That will solve the debt problem. But if you're an investor, you better be careful, because who gets hurt in inflation? I just talked about flipping from deflation to inflation. Okay. Who gets hurt in inflation? Fixed income, a saver, you're relying on insurance policy, annuities, public pensions, cash in the bank,
Pretty much everyone.
Pretty much everyone, except maybe other commodities. But yeah, everyone gets hurt. So this is very tricky. Right now, cash is a good asset, and gold is a good asset, because we're in a period of deflation. But that's going to flip.
But cash won't be a good asset.
Correct. So what you have to do, you have to be very nimble. Our job is to point out these signals. Our job is to inform the readers when the deflation is getting ready to switch to inflation. But the easiest way to tell is the dollar price of gold. So when you see the dollar price of gold going up, yeah, it's fine if you own gold. I'm all for it. But don't think of gold as going up. Think of the dollar as going down. And that's early warning of inflation.
You've mentioned that when we're talking about Latin America and developing countries, that we talking about the developing countries, should develop our industries to try to supply the U.S., since China is on one hand it's becoming expensive, and on the other hand has becoming as getting into this geopolitical problem with the U.S. So right. we need to supply the U.S. And this related to stock market. During the last decade, the emerging countries stock markets have underperformed the U.S. So would you now be the time to bet on the developing countries, stock market developing countries, against the U.S. stock market?
Yeah, it all depends on the country. I don't think you can speak generically or maybe generally about developing economies. You have to take them one by one. What's the governance structure? What's the political structure? Who's in charge of policy? Are the policies good? Do you have an educated workforce? Do you have natural resources? There's just a whole long list of things. I would not bet on Turkey, for example. Turkey is got a huge external debt, dollar-denominated debt. Its hard currency income is drying up because tourism is down. A lot of things they rely on are down, and they're in a geopolitical fight with Russia and the United States and Syria, and their president is Erdogan is more less democratic all the time. So Turkey looks like a place I would avoid. I would keep out of China for a lot of reasons. Some of them are financial, and some of them are maybe more moral and ethical. But I would look at a place like India. I think India will be the big winner of when America pulls its supply chain out of China, which we are. It could go a lot of places. Some of those jobs will come back to the United States. Believe it or not, U.S. labor is actually competitive with Chinese labor at this point in some respects. Some of them will come back to the United States, but in many cases, the CEOs of the companies will be looking at developing economies and saying who's got the right mix of, tax policy, good central bank, good governance, good leadership, et cetera. And they will put some of those factories or research centers or more high value added things in those countries. I would say, Argentina should absolutely be a candidate. It has natural resources. It has ports. It is an attractive destination. Nice people. Great food, well-educated workforce. I mean, Argentina has a lot going for it, but it's had government problems for decades, and some of them are getting better. But so I'd keep an eye on Argentina and Chile. India will be a big winner, but even countries that don't appear to have a lot going for them from the outside might have very good policies that would make them attractive for certain jobs, and I would put Jordan on that list. So I think the answer is you have to go country by country, and ask yourself, do you have something going for you in terms of resources, an educated workforce, good governance, good rule of law, and if the answer is yes, then look at that country for particular opportunities. But there are going to be a lot of them because we're going to rip all this out of China, and it's going to go somewhere. And there's no reason Argentina couldn't be a beneficiary of that.
What do you think about Mexico?
I put Mexico on my list of failed states. I don't think I wouldn't put a nickel into Mexico. I think of Mexico is not too far removed from Venezuela or maybe Lebanon today. These are Syria as another example. These are real failed states. You can call them states, but they're not really states. They're in a civil war, and maybe they belong to the IMF and the United Nations and the World Bank, and they've got a governance structure and they look like states, but they're not really. And by the way, I've been to Mexico many times. Mexican people are wonderful. I love the country. I love the climate. As I said, I've been there, the Pacific coast, the Caribbean coast, the Yucatan. So I'm a big fan of Mexico, but I'm also an analyst and a realist, and I know what's going on. And the Mexican government estimates that they only really control about 30% of their territory. That 70% is under the control of the cartels. When I say cartels, I mean the government has sent troops in, sent the army in, and the army's been defeated in pitched battles with the Zetas and other cartels. So, and if you happen to live in one of those areas, so let's just say you're a civilian, you don't want to be in the drug business, or you don't want to be corrupt. Well, they'll kill you. So everyone ends up being in the drug business, and you'll probably get killed anyway. So I regard Mexico as a failed state, and I wouldn't put any investment there.
Okay, and the other country in the region I'd like you to please to highlight is it's Colombia. We have several new readers there.
Yeah, Colombia, I think is I would put it in the positive category, like India, Argentina. I mean, Colombia and Argentina are much richer than India on a per capita basis. I understand that they're further along in terms of development, but Colombia is like Argentina in the sense that they've had a lot of problems in the past, but they seem to have put those behind them, and they seem to be on a very good path. And so I would be, if you said I could take a certain portion of my portfolio and look at well-run companies in Colombia, Argentina, I would say, yeah, that's a very, and India for that matter, that's a very interesting portfolio. Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Our analysts will have a little bit of homework to do getting into that. And I'd like to go to something that I mentioned at the beginning, and it's linked with the several topics that we've been discussing. It's cryptocurrencies. I mean, when you were describing gold, and you're saying an ounce is an ounce, doesn't pay interest. It's like I was thinking in Bitcoin. What do you think about cryptocurrencies in general, and about Bitcoin in particular?
Well, the number one cryptocurrency in the world is the U.S. dollar. And when I say that, people kind of think, what are you talking about? But the U.S. dollar has been, U.S. Treasury notes, for example, have been digital since the early 1980s. The last time anybody had a paper treasury note that they could wave around was the early 1980s. So the dollar, you might have a few dollars in your pocket for whatever, just local, what we call walking around money. But the overwhelming majority of all dollar transactions are digital. and all that message traffic is encrypted. So the dollar is the #1 digital cryptocurrency. Now, the records are not kept on a blockchain, but why do you need a blockchain? Dollars issued by the United States, the United States Treasury and the Federal Reserve keep very careful records of who owns what treasury bonds and what the bank balances are. And, you have the clearinghouse and the Fedwire, and for that matter, SWIFT in Belgium. And so it's not as if there are a lot of disputes about which bank owns which deposit. That it's not impossible, but that almost never happens. As far as Bitcoin, my problem with Bitcoin, I don't like Bitcoin. I don't think it has, it doesn't have a use case other than terrorists, tax evaders, pornographers, certain classes of criminals might find it useful, although there are other cryptocurrencies as well. But it's something that, if millennials or Generation Z want to gamble a little bit, I prefer roulette. I like to go to the casino. But if you want to gamble a little bit, sure, Bitcoin, have some fun. But I don't see that it has any future. Now, blockchain technology is different. You have to separate the cryptocurrency and the blockchain. Blockchain, as a way to design systems, has a very bright future, and people are finding new uses for it all the time. So you're going to see more and more transactions, whether it's deeds to your house, stock ownership, bond ownership, any kind of transfer you can think of, inventory management will migrate to blockchains, and you'll have what's called a permissioned blockchain. Bitcoin is not a permissioned blockchain. Anybody can mine a Bitcoin. You could go to our computer with some off-the-shelf software. We can mine a couple of Bitcoins and sell them to somebody. You don't need permission to do that. But a permission blockchain is where you actually do need permission. It's like joining a club. So I'll make up an example, all the soybean producers in the world could join a club and have a permission blockchain to keep track of soybean sales and purchases and shipments, and that could be a very effective system and a very efficient system. And you would sort of decentralize the trust component. In other words, who's going to actually keep the records? So yeah, the blockchain will be around more and more, and but these cryptocurrencies will never displace any of the major reserve currencies, because the central banks won't let it. They'll destroy the cryptocurrencies.